Hello and welcome to our lecture on probability and odds. So let's go ahead and talk about this section and this lecture. We'll do a quick overview before we actually get into the details of the lecture. So what am I going to be covering today? Well, I'm going to be covering the concepts of mathematical probabilities and odds and how they loosely relate to poker. Why are they so important? Well, we need to understand the concepts of odds and probability to really use mathematics at the poker table, and it's just as simple as that. Because when we talk about pot odds, implied odds, equity, and so forth, and all-in equity, we need to really understand odds and probabilities to make correct mathematical decisions in a hand. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about probability. So what is probability? Probability is nothing more than the likelihood that something will happen. And I have this broken down in a very simple example. So when we're talking about probability, it's used to describe the number of times something will happen out of the total chances it's happening. So we're talking about the total chances. So for example, it's usually expressed as a fraction or a percentage. So 1 over 2, which is 1/2, is the same thing as 50%. Now let's do a simple example. A simple example I put up there is that there is a 60% chance that it's going to rain today. 60% would be the same as 60 over 100 or 6 over 10. And what that equals to is, again, 60%. So let's do another one. The probability of flipping a coin, and we're talking about a coin with a heads and a tail. One side is heads, one side is tail. The probability of flipping a coin and getting heads is 1 out of 2 because you have two sides, right? You have one side's heads, one side's tail, and the probability of landing on one or the other is always going to be 1. And so if we just go ahead and we look at this by looking at a simple example and looking at this fraction, probability is equal to the number of desirable outcomes over the number of all the possible outcomes. So again, if we did our coin flip example, probability of getting heads is always going to be our desirable outcome. We want heads, that's going to be 1 on the top. Total outcomes is going to be 2 because there's heads and tails. So that's what probability is. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about odds. So odds is simply another way of expressing probability, and odds are expressed as ratios. So for example, we have here 2 to 1. So this is always stated as 2 to 1. In poker, we're really mainly concerned with two types of odds. Pot odds, which is a risk to reward ratio, and then the odds of making a drawing hand. So these are the odds when we're behind, and the odds are how often, what's the probability of us actually making our hand. So the odds of hitting our hand, such as a flush or a straight. Now when we're talking about pot odds, for example, you may be in a poker hand and you are looking at your HUD and it says that you're getting 2 to 1 pot odds. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a reward to risk ratio where you have to risk 1 to win 2. Now in regards to the odds of making a drawing hand, we're not really going to talk about that in this course. I could break it down and talk about the mathematics behind the odds of making a drawing hands, but we're going to use an easier way to do this. We're going to calculate odds of making drawing hands by percentages rather than odds of making our drawing hands by ratios, simply because it's much easier to interpret and understand when we're talking about percentages, especially for beginners, versus when we're talking about odds. So what we're going to focus in this course and in this lecture is we're going to focus on our risk to reward ratio pot odds, and we'll be doing some examples of that. And I'm also going to be working on showing you how to convert odds to percentages. So if you're ever in a hand, or if you have a HUD where it's outputting your odds of making your hand in a ratio format, you can easily convert that as well. So let's go ahead and let's jump to the next slide. So again, odds are common reward to risk ratios when we're talking about pot odds, and I put together some really simple and common gambling examples that you would see in a casino. Since we're talking about poker, I figured it would be appropriate to talk about gambling examples. So for example, anybody who plays blackjack, right? Some tables may pay you 3 to 2 whenever you hit a blackjack. So what does it mean when you sit down at the table and you see on the table on the felt it's written there, blackjack pays 3 to 2? What does that mean? Well, for every $2 that you wager as a risk, you will win $3 whenever you hit blackjack. So if you wager $4, then you will win $6. So it's a simple reward to risk ratio. Now let's do an example of roulette. So let's say you bet on a single number on roulette and they tell you that it pays 35 to 1. So if you bet $1 on a number, let's say, we bet on black 46. Sorry, not black 46, but black 16 because it doesn't go up to 46. Say we bet on black 16 and we hit it. We only wager $1. They're going to pay us $35 for hitting that number. So when the odds are 35 to 1, they are rewarding us $35 where we're risking $1. So poker pot odds are the same, and what will happen in this course is that we'll learn how to calculate pot odds later in the course. Not in this lecture, but later in the course you'll get it. And actually I believe it's 2 lectures from now you'll learn how to quickly calculate your pot odds. So now let's talk about converting odds to percentages. And I have the example here in regards to our reward to risk ratio, but you can take any ratio that's in an odds format ratio and convert it to a percentage by following this calculation and this mathematical equation. So what does 2 to 1 pot odds really mean? Well, we can convert that to percentage to better get an idea of what 2 to 1 means. So what you'll see here is that I have my ratio here, so my odds ratio of m to n. What we're going to do to convert this to a fraction and then a fraction to a percentage, we're going to take the n, put it on top, we're going to add these two and put them in the denominator. So the n's in the numerator, both of the different numbers are going to be added together and summed up, and that's going to be in the denominator, and then we can convert that fraction to a percentage. So for example, let's convert 2 to 1. So 2 to 1, and I have here an example m to n. So 1's going to go on the top, 2 plus 1, so we're adding both these numbers, it's going to go on the bottom, and this is actually now going to be 1/3, and 1/3 equals 33.3%. So what does 2 to 1 pot odds? It means that we have 33.3% pot odds. And this may not make much sense to you now, but when I talk in more details of pot odds in a later lecture, it'll make much more sense. Let's do a couple more examples. So let's convert 3 to 1 odds against to a fraction percentage. So let's say we're given 3 to 1. Let's convert 3 to 1 odds to a percentage. So again, the 1 goes in the numerator. We add up 3 plus 1. We put that in the denominator. That equals 1/4. Convert that fraction to percentage. That equals 25%. 3 to 1 odds equals 25% pot odds. Now, I did leave this up here as odds against, so this would mean that when we are trying to draw out to a hand, let's say that we're in a drawing hand and it says that you have 3 to 1 odds to make in your hand. What this is telling us, if we're looking to draw to a best hand, it says that we're going to make that hand 25% of the time. Now if we're looking at this and it's pot odds, 3 to 1 pot odds, then 3 to 1 pot odds is going to equal 25% pot odds. If you want me to elaborate further on odds against, go ahead and let me know and I'll definitely do so. But just remember, if you see this outputted in regards to the odds of making your hand, it's the same thing in regards to converting to a percentage and a fraction as it is for pot odds. So again, let's do 4 to 1 odds. So let's say we are giving 4 to 1 odds. Let's go ahead and convert that. Again, this number goes in the numerator. We add up these two numbers, put them in the denominator, so this equals 1/5. Convert that to a percentage, 20%. So 4 to 1 odds equals 20%. And if you're given 4 to 1 odds of making your hand, that means you're going to make your hand 20% of the time. If you're getting 4 to 1 pot odds, that means you have 20% pot odds. Now, if this is confusing to you, I recommend that you start back with the previous slide and work through these examples and do them again. And once you do this a few times, it's going to become second nature. And once we start getting into this in further lectures, it's also going to become second nature, just because practice makes perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this lecture with a simple, easy shortcut for you to print out and post up by your computer. So if you play online, if you don't want to have to do odds to percentages, conversions on the fly, well, you have a table right here. So 1 to 1 equals 50%, 2 to 1 equals 33%, and so forth, all the way down to 7 to 1. 7 to 1 means you have 12.5% odds. And again, if this is confusing, don't worry, because it'll make much more sense once we start talking about it in regards to pot odds, and I'm talking about the amount of money in the pot, how much you have to call, and so forth. So don't worry about that right now. I just really want you to understand that this odds ratio equals to this odd percentage, and I want you to understand how to convert odds ratios to odds percentages, and also understanding the concepts of probabilities and odds in general. So that's going to go ahead and conclude this lecture. As usual, if you have any questions, definitely let me know. If not, thank you for watching, and we will see you at the next lecture.